Clara Whitmore did not cry when Mrs. Aldridge pointed at her body in front of the entire Harlow household and declared her unfit. She did not cry when they threw her suitcase off the porch steps into the snow. She walked to the station with her head up, each step deliberate, because she had learned long ago that dignity was the only thing people like that could never take from you. But standing alone on that empty platform, as the last train disappeared into the gray Wyoming horizon, Clara finally sat down on her suitcase and wept. If this story already moved you in the first few seconds, you haven't seen anything yet. Please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you for a long time. And drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that station platform in Wyoming and to the woman sitting alone in the snow with nowhere left to go. The Aldridge house had smelled like cedar and money, the kind of home Clara had spent 3 weeks convincing herself she could belong to. She had answered their advertisement in the Chicago Tribune in October. Governess sought experience with children references required, and she had provided all of it. References. Experience. A letter from the schoolmarm in Peoria, who called her the finest natural teacher she had ever encountered. Mrs. Aldridge had written back within a week, and for a brief foolish moment, Clara had believed that competence might actually be enough. It was not enough. She had known something was wrong the moment she stepped off the train in Casper and saw Mrs. Aldridge's face go still. Not rude, the woman was too practiced for outright rudeness, but still. The way a person's expression goes still, when reality doesn't match expectation. Clara had seen that look her entire life. She had simply hoped in her weaker moments that Wyoming might be different from Chicago. Wyoming was not different. For 3 weeks, she had taught the Aldridge children their letters and arithmetic with patience and creativity that impressed even the skeptical Mr. Aldridge. She had coaxed their younger daughter through a fear of reading aloud. She had stayed up past midnight twice when the boy Thomas struggled with long division and refused to sleep until he understood it. She had done everything right, and then Mrs. Aldridge had called her into the parlor on a Tuesday morning, gathered 3 of the neighbor women as witnesses for reasons Clara still did not fully understand, and announced clearly, precisely, without a trace of embarrassment, that Clara's physical appearance was setting a poor example for the children. "We have a certain standard in this household," Mrs. Aldridge had said, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I'm sure you understand." Clara had understood perfectly. She had understood for 32 years. She was given 1 hour to pack. Her pay for the 3 weeks was left in an envelope on the kitchen table. No one handed it to her directly, and her suitcase was brought to the porch by the housemaid, who at least had the decency to look ashamed. Mrs. Aldridge watched from the doorway as Clara carried it herself down the front steps and into the snow. "I do hope you find suitable employment," Mrs. Aldridge called after her. Her tone suggested she did not hope this at all. Clara had not answered. She walked the 2 miles to the train station in boots that were not made for Wyoming winter, and she did not look back once. The station in Mill Haven was barely more than a wooden platform and a small building that smelled of coal smoke and stale coffee. It was run by a man named Greeley, who wore his suspenders too tight and had the permanently irritated expression of someone who had chosen the wrong profession and never forgiven himself for it. "Next train east doesn't come through until Thursday," Greeley said, not looking up from his ledger. Clara stood at the window and tried to do the arithmetic quietly in her head. Thursday was 2 days away. The envelope from Mrs. Aldridge held enough to cover the train fare back to Chicago, with perhaps $1 and some change left over. Which meant 2 nights somewhere, which meant a rooming house, which meant money she did not have. "Is there a rooming house in town?" she asked. Greeley looked up then. He looked at her the way people always looked at her when they decided to see only one thing. "Mabel's place takes boarders," he said. $1 a night." "Thank you." She turned from the window and found a bench along the platform wall. The afternoon light was already fading, the kind of early dark that February brought to Wyoming without apology. She set her suitcase on the ground in front of her, folded her hands in her lap, and told herself very firmly that she was not going to cry. She cried anyway. not loudly. Clara had never been someone who cried loudly. She cried the way she did most things quietly, thoroughly, and without asking anyone to notice. She pressed her fingers against her mouth and looked out at the empty track and let herself feel just for a few minutes the full weight of what her life had become. 32 years old, no family left, no permanent home in 4 years, no position, no prospects. The city of Chicago had been too much. The city of Denver before that had been too much. And now Wyoming. She was apparently too much for all of it. 3 men came through the station around 4 o'clock, farmers by the look of them, heading home after business in town. They noticed her immediately. Women traveling alone always drew attention in stations like this one. And Clara heard the shift in their voices as they passed her, the low murmuring that she recognized without needing to make out individual words. "Wonder what she's doing out here. Can't be a mail-order bride, surely." The laughter that followed was the specific kind that men use when they want to be cruel and maintain the ability to later claim they meant nothing by it. Clara kept her eyes forward. She had learned that looking away too quickly gave them the satisfaction of knowing the words had landed. She had learned, too, that looking at them directly often made things worse. There was a very narrow path between those two things, and she had walked it so many times she could do it without thinking. The men moved on. The station emptied again. By 5 o'clock, Greeley was making noises about closing the office for the evening, though the platform itself remained open. Clara asked if she might stay on the bench until morning, rather than spend the $1 on a room she could not afford, and Greeley looked at her with an expression that moved through several emotions before settling on a grudging sort of pity. "Suit yourself," he said. "But it gets cold." "I'm aware," Clara said. He locked the office door behind him. She pulled her coat tighter and watched the last light leave the sky. She was still sitting there, still watching the dark, when she heard boots on the platform boards behind her, a heavier tread than Greeley's, and then something else. Smaller steps. 2 sets of them, quick and light, the unmistakable sound of children running somewhere they'd been told not to run. "Boys?" A man's voice, low and firm. "I said walk." The footsteps slowed. Clara turned slightly. Coming along the platform toward the office window were 3 figures. A tall man in a dark coat and hat with his collar pulled up against the wind, and beside him holding each one of his hands, 2 small boys. They were the same height, the same build, and even in the poor light, the same face. Twins, she thought. Maybe 7 or 8 years old, both of them wearing coats that were clean but too thin for the weather, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. The man tried the office door, found it locked, and muttered something under his breath. "Is he closed?" one of the boys asked. "Appears so." "We can come back tomorrow," the other boy said. This one had a slightly quieter voice, more careful. "It's all right, Papa." "It ain't all right," the man said, but gently, the way someone says something that's true but doesn't want it to be. "I needed those shipping papers tonight." Clara looked back at the track. None of her business. She was very practiced at minding her own affairs. "Eli," the first boy said, tugging the other one's sleeve. "There's a lady." Clara heard footsteps approaching. She did not move. "Ma'am?" The man's voice was closer now. She turned to find him standing a few feet away, hat in hand, the twins arranged on either side of him like 2 small bookends. He was younger than she'd expected, somewhere in his middle 30s, with dark eyes and the kind of weathered face that came from working outdoors in every season. He looked tired in the specific way that she had come to recognize in people carrying things they couldn't put down. "Sorry to bother you. You all right out here?" Clara blinked. In her experience, strangers in train stations did not ask if she was all right. They stared, or they looked away, or they laughed. This man was doing none of those things. He was simply looking at her steady and direct, the way a person looked at another person. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." He didn't move away. One of the boys, the bolder one, she thought, was watching her with frank, uncomplicated curiosity, the way only children could stare without malice. "You been crying," the bold twin said. "James." His father said the name in a single quiet syllable that carried the full weight of parental correction. "I have been a little," Clara said to the boy. "It's been a difficult day." James considered this with great seriousness. "Our days are difficult too sometimes," he said. "Papa says it's all right to have bad days as long as you don't stop getting up." "That's very good advice," Clara said. She looked at the other boy, Eli, the first one had called him. Eli was watching her too, but differently, quieter. His eyes moved over her face with a kind of careful attention that reminded her painfully of the children she had taught, the ones who had learned early to read adult faces for signs of what was coming. "My name is Ethan Calloway," the man said. He didn't extend his hand, not because he was being impolite, she thought, but because both his hands were occupied with his sons. "These are my boys, James and Eli." "Clara Whitmore," she said. "You waiting on the Thursday train?" "I am." Ethan Calloway looked at her suitcase, then at the locked office behind him, then back at her. He was adding things up. She could see it the way practical men did, quietly and without drawing attention to it. "Station's closed," he said, "and the night's only getting colder." "I know." "You got somewhere to stay?" Clara lifted her chin very slightly. It was not pride exactly. It was the reflex of someone who had spent a long time making sure that whatever she needed, she never looked like she needed it. "I'll manage," she said. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at James, who was still watching Clara with uncomplicated interest, and at Eli, who had not looked away from her face. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I don't make a habit of asking strangers for favors." "You aren't asking me for a favor," she said carefully. "You're about to offer me one." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "I'm about to offer you a warm house and a meal," he said. "In exchange for, well, that's the harder part to explain." "Try," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment, working through something. James tugged once on his hand. "Papa," the boy said. "Give me a minute, son." Ethan looked at Clara. "My wife died 14 months ago. Fever took her faster than any of us could catch up to. I've been running the ranch and raising these two on my own since then, and He stopped, started again. "I'm not managing as well as I'd like to be." "I'm sorry about your wife," Clara said. He nodded once, accepting it without deflection. "Eli here." He looked down at the quiet twin. He used to talk all the time. Couldn't get him to stop some days. Since his mama passed, he barely says 10 words together. He paused. "James talks enough for both of them, which—" He glanced at his son. "Which we're grateful for. But Eli's got something locked up inside him, and I don't know how to reach it." Eli had gone very still. He was still looking at Clara, but his expression had changed, tightened, in the way that children's faces do when adults are discussing their pain and they are pretending not to hear. Clara looked directly at Eli. "What do you like?" she asked him simply. Eli blinked. "Not what your papa says, not what your brother thinks," she said. "What do you like?" The boy was quiet for such a long moment that Clara thought he might not answer. Then very quietly, "Horses," he said, "and stories. About places far away." "Me too," Clara said. Eli looked at her with something in his face that was too careful to be hope and too warm to be anything else. Ethan watched the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite name. "I can't pay much," he said, "but the room is warm and the food is plain, and my boys need—" He stopped again. "They need someone kind," he said finally. "More than they need someone qualified. And from what I just saw, Miss Whitmore, I think you might be the kindest person I've come across in a long time." Clara looked at this man standing on a frozen train platform with his 2 sons hat in hand, asking her with no more protection than his own honest decency to come and help him hold something together that was threatening to fall apart. She thought about Chicago. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge's carefully folded hands. She thought about the letter in her bag and the $1.50 she had to her name and the train on Thursday that would take her back to a city that had never once felt like it had room for her. She thought about Eli's quiet voice saying horses and stories about places far away. "It would be temporary," she said. "Of course," Ethan said. "I would need my own room." "You'd have it." "And I won't tolerate unkindness," she said, "from anyone. If people in your town have things to say about how I look, Mr. Calloway, I need to know now whether you're the kind of man who's going to step back and let them say it." Ethan Calloway looked at her without hesitation. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm not that kind of man." She believed him. She couldn't have explained afterward why she believed him so quickly and so completely, except that there are people in the world whose honesty lives in their face, where you can see it, and Ethan Calloway was one of them. "All right," Clara said. James made a small, sharp sound of triumph and immediately tried to grab her hand, thought better of it, and settled for bouncing twice on his heels. "You can sit beside me in the wagon," he announced. "I'll tell you about the ranch. The horses are named James," his father said. "Buck and Harriet, and the old one we call Governor, James. And there's a barn cat, but she's mean to everyone except Eli." James Calloway, take a breath. James took a breath. Then he looked up at Clara with his father's dark eyes and his mother's smile, or what Clara imagined might have been his mother's smile, bright and unguarded and completely without reservation. "I'm glad you're coming," he said. "Thank you," Clara said. "I'm glad too." She picked up her suitcase. Ethan moved to take it from her without asking, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who carried things as a matter of course and saw no particular ceremony in it. She let him not because she couldn't carry it herself. She had been carrying her own weight in every possible sense for 32 years, but because the gesture was simple and decent, and she could not remember the last time someone had made a simple, decent gesture in her direction without wanting something complicated in return. Eli walked beside her as they moved off the platform toward the wagon. He didn't speak, but after they had gone a few steps, she felt something touch her hand very lightly. Barely a brush, and she looked down to find that Eli had closed the distance between them until he was walking close enough that his small fingers were just grazing the back of her hand in the dark. Not holding on, just there, as if making sure she was real, as if making sure she wasn't going to disappear the way the last woman he'd loved had disappeared. Clara looked straight ahead. She did not say anything. She did not make a fuss or draw attention to the small, fragile thing that was happening beside her in the dark. She simply adjusted her arm very slightly until her hand was easier for Eli to reach. The wagon was waiting at the end of the platform road, 2 horses blowing steam into the cold air. James climbed up immediately and arranged himself with the authority of someone who had very clear opinions about where everyone should sit. Ethan lifted Clara's suitcase into the back without ceremony, and then turned to offer her a hand up, not in the exaggerated performative way that some men offered it, as if the act itself was the point, but practically steadily, the way someone helps another person do a thing that needs doing. She took it. They drove out of Millhaven under a sky so full of stars that the darkness between them seemed almost secondary. The road was rough and cold, and the wind came off the ridge hard enough to sting. James talked about the ranch with inexhaustible enthusiasm, covering in 12 minutes more information about horses, weather patterns, the personality differences between various types of cattle, and a detailed description of a coyote he had once seen near the creek than most adults managed in an hour. Ethan said very little. Eli sat on Clara's left side and said nothing at all, but he did not move away from her. And twice when the wagon hit a rough patch in the road and she lurched sideways, she felt his small shoulder press back against her arm, with the steady, serious comfort of a child who has decided quietly and entirely on his own that he is going to be brave for someone else. Clara looked out at the dark land stretching away on both sides of the road and tried to remember the last time she had been somewhere that felt even distantly like it might have room for her. She had spent so long being too much for everyone that she had stopped believing there was a place where too much might be exactly enough. She was not ready yet to believe it now. She had been burned before by the particular cruelty of hope. But sitting in that wagon in the Wyoming dark, with James's voice threading through the cold air, and Eli's quiet shoulder, warm against hers, and Ethan Calloway's profile steady against the night sky ahead. Clara Whitmore thought very carefully, very guardedly that she might be willing to see. Just to see. The ranch appeared in the distance as a collection of lights against the black prairie. Small lights, the kind that speak of people trying to hold warmth inside a wide, cold world. They grew larger as the wagon moved toward them, and with them came the shapes of buildings, a barn, a fence line, the ghost of what had once been and might still be a working, living place. James had fallen quiet at last, tired out by his own energy, his head beginning to tip toward Clara's arm. He caught himself twice straightened, and then gave up the fight entirely, and let his head drop against her shoulder, with the complete, uncalculating trust of a child who has simply decided that someone is safe. Ethan glanced over at his son, and then at Clara, and something moved through his expression. Something careful and complicated, and very much not ready to be spoken aloud. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Just that." Clara looked at the lights of the ranch growing steadily closer. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Calloway," she said. "I haven't done anything." "You're here," he said. "That's more than most." She didn't answer. She didn't know how to answer. Something said that plainly without decoration or hidden meaning. She had spent so long listening for the catch in people's words, the place where kindness turned into something else, that simple honesty left her briefly without language. The wagon rolled on. Above them, the Wyoming stars burned cold and indifferent and spectacular, the way the sky only looks in places far from the noise of cities where the darkness is deep enough to show you how much light there actually is. And Clara Whitmore, who had sat down on a suitcase in the snow 3 hours ago and let herself believe that she had run out of road. Clara Whitmore looked at those lights and felt against every reasonable instinct she possessed, the first small stubborn stirring of something that had no business surviving what she had put it through. It felt absurdly dangerously like the beginning of home. The Calloway Ranch looked different in daylight than it had in the dark. Not worse exactly, just honest, the kind of honest that dark and distance are always merciful enough to soften. Clara stood on the porch with a cup of coffee that Ethan had left on the kitchen table before heading out at first light, and she looked at what surrounded her with the clear, practical eye of a woman who had never had the luxury of pretending a problem was smaller than it was. The fence along the north pasture had 3 broken posts she could count from where she stood. The barn door hung at an angle that suggested the hinge had been loose for months, and nobody had found the time or energy to fix it. A pile of feed sacks near the far wall had frozen solid overnight. And somewhere inside the house behind her, she could hear James Calloway attempting to negotiate with his brother about something involving a boot, a disagreement that had been escalating in volume for the past 4 minutes. She went back inside. James had one boot. Eli had the other. The argument, as best she could reconstruct it, had something to do with whose turn it was to feed the barn cat, and the boot had become a hostage in negotiations. "That's my boot," James said. "You said you'd do it yesterday, and you didn't," Eli said. This was, Clara noted, more words than she had heard from Eli since the wagon ride. "I was busy." "You were playing." "Playing is busy." "Give me back my boot, James." "Feed the cat first." Clara set her coffee cup down on the table. Both boys looked at her. She looked back at them without particular urgency and said, "James, give your brother his boot." James looked at the boot, looked at her, looked at the boot again. Then he handed it over with the expression of someone making a great personal sacrifice for the good of civilization. "Fine," he said. "But he still has to feed the cat." "That seems fair," Clara said. "Eli, are you willing to feed the cat if James gives you your boot with no further argument?" Eli put the boot on. "Yes," he said. "Then that's settled." Clara turned back to the stove. "Breakfast in 10 minutes. Both of you wash your hands." There was a brief pause behind her, the specific silence of children recalibrating when an adult handles them differently than they expected. Then she heard 2 sets of feet head toward the door. "She's different," James said in what he clearly believed was a whisper. "I know," Eli said. Clara kept her face toward the stove and allowed herself exactly one small smile before she put it away. Ethan came in from the barn just before the eggs were done, stamping snow from his boots at the door, with the automatic efficiency of a man who had performed the same motion 10,000 times. He stopped when he saw the table set the food ready. Both boys already seated with clean hands, a state of domestic order that from the slight widening of his eyes was not exactly the norm. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Sit down, Mr. Calloway. The eggs are going cold." He sat. James launched immediately into a detailed account of the boot negotiation and its peaceful resolution. Ethan listened to his son and looked at Clara with an expression she did not have a name for, yet something between relief and a caution that hadn't quite decided whether it was willing to relax. She did not push it. She understood caution. She had been building her own walls long enough to recognize another person's from the outside. The morning moved forward. Clara washed the dishes while Ethan went back to the work that never stopped on a working ranch, and she began quietly and without announcement to take stock of the house. What it had, what it needed, what had been left undone, not from carelessness, but from the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being one person trying to do the work of two. The pantry was thin. Not empty, but thin, the kind of thin that spoke of careful rationing, and of someone who checked the supplies every night with a knot in his stomach. She found a ledger on the kitchen shelf that she had no business opening, and opened it anyway, because she had learned that the truth of any household lived in its numbers, and if she was going to be useful here, she needed to know what she was working with. The numbers were not good. She closed the ledger and put it back exactly where she had found it. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and breathed through what she had seen. Then she picked up her coat and went out to find Ethan. He was at the fence line driving a new post into the frozen ground with focused economical effort. He heard her coming and didn't stop working. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "You can call me Ethan." He drove the post down again. Mr. Calloway was my father, and he wasn't a man worth emulating. "Ethan," she said, "I saw the ledger." The post went in. He straightened and looked at her. Not angry, she noticed, just tired in the way of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation and is simply relieved it has arrived. "I should have warned you," he said. "It's bad. How much time do you have?" Bank's been patient. Victor Hale has been less patient. "Who is Victor Hale?" Ethan's jaw shifted. "Man who owns the land east of mine. Wants mine too on account of the water supply that runs through the lower pasture. Offered me twice what it's worth last spring." He picked up the post driver again. "I told him no. And since then," he looked at her steadily. "Since then, 3 of my hands quit. 2 of them told me afterward that Hale's foreman had visited them first. I've lost 7 head of cattle to circumstances I can't prove weren't natural. And last month, someone cut the fence on the south pasture in 3 places and ran off another 4 animals before I caught it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Have you told the sheriff?" "Sheriff Dodd plays cards with Victor Hale on Friday nights." He said it without heat, just flat certainty. "So no, the sheriff has not been a reliable option." She stood beside him in the cold and looked out at the land, his land, the land this man was holding on to with both hands, while everything around him worked to peel his fingers loose. "What do you need most?" she asked. "Time," he said, "and about 3 more workers I can trust and can't afford." "Start with what you can do today," Clara said. "I'll handle the house and the boys. You handle the land. We'll work out the rest as we go." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're very practical for a woman who arrived on this ranch 12 hours ago." "I've been practical my whole life," Clara said. "It's the only thing that's kept me upright." She turned back toward the house. "The barn door hinge needs fixing. I noticed it this morning." "I know." "The feed sacks by the north wall have frozen solid." "I know." "And James put a frog in Eli's coat pocket, which Eli discovered approximately 20 minutes ago and handled with more restraint than I would have." Ethan rubbed a hand over his face and made a sound that was almost a laugh. It came out rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while. "I'll talk to James," he said. "James is fine. He just needs direction." She paused. "It's Eli I'm more concerned about." The almost laugh disappeared. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "Me too." She left him to the fence and went back inside. The day built itself around work, which Clara had always found to be the most reliable cure for the particular kind of pain that thinking too hard about your circumstances produced. She cooked and cleaned and repaired 2 tears in James's shirt that had been left for so long they were threatening to become something larger, and she read aloud from a book she had found on the shelf, a collection of frontier stories, well-worn, the pages soft from handling, while both boys sat at the kitchen table, ostensibly doing the schoolwork she had set them, but actually listening to her with complete and transparent absorption. James gave up the pretense first. "What happens to him?" he asked, chin in his hands, arithmetic forgotten. "Does he find the horses?" "Finish your multiplication, and I'll read the next chapter," Clara said. James applied himself to multiplication with sudden extraordinary focus. Eli said nothing, but when she glanced up he was watching her with that same careful attention he'd shown the night before, measuring something she wasn't sure she could name. It was late afternoon when the trouble arrived, and it arrived in the form of 2 women from town, who appeared at the front door with a covered dish and the very specific kind of friendly expression that has nothing friendly underneath it. Clara answered the door because Ethan was at the barn, and the boys were in the back room. "You must be the woman Ethan took in," the taller one said. Her name, she offered without prompting, was Mrs. Pratt, and she said it the way people say their names when they expect the name to mean something. "We heard you were staying out here." "News travels fast," Clara said. "Small town." Mrs. Pratt's eyes moved over Clara with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has made assessments her entire life and gotten very quick at them. "We wanted to bring something for the boys. They've had a difficult year." "That's very kind," Clara said. "I'll make sure they get it." She reached for the dish. Mrs. Pratt did not immediately release it. "You know," Mrs. Pratt said in the tone of someone about to offer information as a favor, "people in Mill Haven care a great deal about those children, about what influences are in their home." Clara looked at her. Not away, not down, directly at her. "I'm sure they do," she said. "A woman in Ethan's position needs to be careful about how things appear." "A woman in Ethan's position," Clara said, "needs someone to help him feed his children and keep his house running, which is what I am here to do. Thank you for the dish, Mrs. Pratt." She took the dish. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with the covered dish in her hands and let the familiar old pain move through her and pass the way she had learned to let it pass without grabbing hold of it. "Who was that?" James appeared from the back hallway. "A neighbor," Clara said. Being neighborly, she carried the dish to the kitchen. "Wash your hands. We'll see what she brought." What Mrs. Pratt had brought turned out to be a very good apple cake, which James judged excellent, and Eli received with one of his rare quiet smiles, and Clara decided that the woman could think whatever she wished as long as the apple cake was this good. Ethan came in for supper and found all 3 of them at the table. The cake half gone, James in the middle of an elaborate story about a horse he intended to one day own, and Eli watching Clara with something in his face that had shifted since yesterday. The careful measuring still there, but with less distance in it. Less bracing for impact. Ethan stood in the doorway and looked at all of this for a moment before sitting down. "Long day?" Clara asked. "Found another cut fence," he said. "South pasture again, same as last month." The table went quiet. James looked at his father. Eli looked at his plate. "Same place?" Clara asked. "Different section. Whoever's doing it knows the land well enough to know which cuts will do the most damage." He said it quietly, aware of his sons keeping his voice level. "Or they're getting help from someone who does." Clara thought about the ledger, about the numbers, about the timeline Ethan was working against. How many more times can this happen before it becomes something you can't recover from? she asked equally quietly. Ethan looked at her across the table. Once, he said. Maybe twice. James had stopped eating. He was 6 years old. No, wait. Clara reminded herself the same age as his brother, and he was listening to his father talk about losing the ranch with the expression of a child who understands more than adults wish he did. Are we going to lose the horses? He asked. No, Ethan said. Promise. Ethan looked at his son. I'm working on it, he said. That's the best I can give you right now. James nodded slowly, processing this. Then he looked at Clara. Are you going to help? He asked. Clara met the boy's eyes. James Calloway, who talked without stopping and charged at the world head first, and asked questions without worrying about whether the answers might be hard. James, who was terrified under all of it and covering it beautifully with noise. Yes, she said, I'm going to help. Eli looked up from his plate. For the first time since she had arrived, he looked at her not with cautious measurement, but with something open and direct, the kind of look that children give when they have made a decision about a person, and the decision is yes. Then, very quietly, he said, Okay, just that. One word. But Ethan's hand stilled on the table beside her, and she understood from the way he held himself, suddenly careful, the way a man holds himself when something precious and fragile is happening nearby, and he is terrified of startling it, that Eli had not said okay to much of anything since his mother died. Clara looked at her plate. She picked up her fork. Eat your supper, she said to no one in particular and all of them at once. It's getting cold. Outside, the wind moved across the Wyoming prairie in long unbroken sweeps, and somewhere in the dark, the south pasture fence sat cut and waiting, and Victor Hale's plan moved forward one quiet, patient step at a time. But inside the Calloway kitchen, with the lamp burning and the apple cake half-eaten on the counter, something else was moving too slower, quieter, and considerably harder to stop than anything Victor Hale had yet tried to use against them. The next morning, Clara was up before first light. She had been awake for an hour already, turning the numbers from the ledger over in her mind, arranging and rearranging the problem the way she had always approached problems that seemed too large, looking for the edge, the place where something small could be done. There was always an edge. She had learned that too. Even the biggest walls had a place where you could get a handhold. She heard movement in the hallway, too careful and deliberate to be James. She didn't turn from the stove. Eli, she said, come sit down. A pause. Then small, quiet footsteps, and Eli settled himself into the chair closest to the stove, closest to the warmth, she noted, which told her something about the temperature of the room he'd come from. Couldn't sleep, she asked. I dreamed about Mama, he said, simple, factual, the way children state enormous things when they trust you enough to say them plainly. Clara kept her hands moving, kept her voice easy. What was she like? Eli thought about this seriously. She smelled like lavender, he said, and she was loud when she laughed. James laughs like her. He paused. I don't. You don't have to laugh like her, Clara said. You're allowed to be yourself. Eli looked at his hands on the table. Do you think she knows? He asked. That we're okay? Clara set the spoon down and turned to look at him directly. 8 years old, with his father's steady eyes and something in his face that was all his own. A quietness that was not sadness exactly, but had grown up so close to it that they had learned each other's shape. I think, she said carefully, that a mother who loved her children the way yours clearly loved you would know. Yes. Eli nodded. He didn't say anything else for a while. But he stayed at the table, and when Clara put a cup of warm milk in front of him, he wrapped both hands around it and held on. That was the morning Victor Hale's man rode onto the ranch. Clara heard the horse, first a single rider, coming in fast, which was unusual enough at that hour that she moved to the window. Ethan was already at the barn door watching. The rider was heavy-set, wearing a coat with a fur collar that was too expensive for the territory he was riding through, and he pulled up in the yard with the deliberate showmanship of someone who has rehearsed his entrance. Calloway, the man called out. Mr. Hale asked me to bring you something." Ethan walked out to meet him, and Clara watched from the window as the man handed down an envelope. Ethan opened it, read it. His face did not change, but his hand, the one not holding the envelope, closed into a fist at his side, slow and tight. "Tell Mr. Hale," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "that my answer is the same as it's been." "Mr. Hale thought you might say that," the writer said pleasantly. "He wanted me to tell you that the bank in Casper has called in the note on your North Pasture loan, due in full. 60 days. Ethan said nothing. 60 days, Calloway. The man gathered his reins. "After that, Mr. Hale is prepared to take the property at fair market value. He's being generous. You'd do well to remember that." He turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Ethan stood in the yard and watched him go, and Clara watched Ethan, and the paper in his hand was very still in the winter air. Eli appeared beside her at the window. He had heard everything. His small face was tight and controlled, and he looked at his father standing alone in the yard. And Clara felt the boy's hand find her arm in the cold morning light, gripping just slightly with a fear he was too proud to name aloud. "It's all right," Clara said quietly. "Is it?" Eli asked. She looked at Ethan Calloway, who had straightened his shoulders and folded the letter, and was already turning back toward the barn, already moving, already working, because that was what this man did when the world tried to knock him down. He got back to work. "We're going to make it all right," she said, and she meant it not as comfort, not as reassurance, but as intention, as a declaration. Eli looked up at her. "We," he said. "We," Clara said. His grip on her arm relaxed. "Not all the way, but enough." The 60-day notice sat on the kitchen shelf where Ethan had set it that morning, and it stayed there all day, like a thing, with weight pressing down on every conversation in the house without being part of any of them. Clara watched Ethan carry it through the hours. Not the paper itself, which he didn't touch again, but the knowledge of it visible in the set of his jaw, and the way he paused sometimes in the middle of a task and stood very still before making himself move again. By evening, she had decided that silence was not going to serve either of them. 60 days is enough time, she said, setting a plate in front of him. Ethan looked up. The boys were in the back room. Outside, the wind was picking up again, finding every gap in the walls it could. "For what exactly?" he said. "To find another option." She sat down across from him. "The water supply is the value, not the land itself. Is there anyone else who would pay for access to it? A rancher, a railroad company, a town council looking to expand their water rights?" He looked at her for a moment. "You're not a woman who lets a problem sit, are you?" "I've never had the luxury," she said. "Think. Is there anyone?" He picked up his fork, put it back down. "There's a man named Alderton in Cheyenne. Had his eye on expanding north 2 years ago before his wife got sick. I don't know his situation now. Can you get a letter to him by Friday? If I ride to the telegraph office tomorrow." "Then ride to the telegraph office tomorrow," Clara said. "And Ethan." She waited until he looked at her directly. "Stop waiting for this to get better on its own. It won't." He was quiet for a long moment. Then quietly, "My wife used to say I was better at working a problem with my hands than my head." "She wasn't wrong," Clara said, "but your hands can't fix this one." He picked up his fork again. This time he ate. The next morning, Ethan rode to town. Clara took the boys with her to collect eggs from the small coop behind the barn, James narrating the personality of each hen with the authority of someone who had personally wronged several of them. Eli walking close to Clara's side with his hands in his coat pockets, and his eyes moving over everything with that quiet, systematic attention she had come to recognize as simply how he saw the world. "Miss Clara," Eli said while James was engaged in a complex negotiation with a particularly uncooperative hen. "Yes. What happens if the bank takes the North Pasture?" She stopped walking. She looked at him. He was looking up at her with his direct, serious eyes, and she understood from his expression that he was not asking because he was frightened. He was asking because he needed accurate information, the way some people do when fear lives not in the unknown, but in the gap between what they imagine and what is real. Then we work with what's left, she said. You still have the main pasture, the house, the barn. A ranch can survive losing one piece of land. But could we keep the horses? Yes. He considered this. Okay, he said. Then, how do you know so much about ranches? You're from Chicago. I'm from a lot of places, Clara said. I've learned something useful in most of them. Eli nodded slowly. That sounds lonely, he said. Clara breathed in the cold morning air. It was, she said. For a long time it was. James emerged from the coop, victorious, 3 eggs in his hands and hay in his hair, and the conversation folded itself into the ordinary business of the morning. But Eli walked the rest of the way back to the house with his shoulder pressed lightly against Clara's arm, the same way he'd walked beside her that first night on the platform, making sure she was still there. Ethan returned from town with the telegram sent, and something else, a stiffness around his shoulders that he hadn't left with. Clara waited until the boys were occupied before asking. Ran into Victor Hale, Ethan said. He was at the sink washing trail dust from his hands with more focus than the task required. Outside the telegraph office. What did he say? Said he'd heard I had a woman staying at the ranch. His hands stilled in the water. Said some other things I won't repeat in this house. Clara felt the familiar cold settle in her chest. She kept her voice level. What did you say? Ethan turned from the sink and looked at her. I told him that the woman staying at my ranch was worth more than every man in Millhaven who had ever had an opinion about her, and that if he or anyone working for him came onto my property uninvited again, they'd regret it considerably. She stared at him. You said that, in front of people. There were about 12 people on the street, Ethan said, not without some satisfaction. Mrs. Pratt was one of them. I expect the whole county will know by supper time. Clara did not know what to do with this information. She stood in the kitchen holding a dish towel and felt something move through her that was too large and too complicated to look at directly. No one had said anything like that for her. Not once in 32 years. Not once. That was, she started. The truth, Ethan said simply. He picked up his coat from the chair. I'll be at the south fence until dark. He paused at the door. Clara. She looked up. You cook a better breakfast than anyone I've known, he said. That's not why you're valuable here, but it doesn't hurt. He went out. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment and pressed one hand flat against the table, steadying herself against something she could not name precisely. In the back room, she could hear James explaining to Eli at length his theory about which of the horses was the smartest. Life, ordinary and insistent, moved on. 3 days passed. The telegraph brought no response from Alderton. Ethan rode out each morning and came back each evening with the same tight jaw, and Clara watched the 60-day clock in his eyes and kept the house warm and the boys steady, and told herself that the edge was there somewhere, the handhold, the place where this could be turned. She just hadn't found it yet. On the 4th day, one of Ethan's 2 remaining hands, a young man named Cole, who had been with the ranch for 2 years and had always seemed solid, didn't show up for the morning work. By noon, Ethan found his bunk cleared out and a month's wages left on the mattress returned without explanation. He wouldn't just leave, Ethan said at supper. He said it not accusingly, not dramatically, just with the flat certainty of someone working out arithmetic. Cole wasn't that kind. He needed this work. Hale got to him, Clara said quietly. Probably. He pushed food around his plate. Which means Hale's been inside my operation long enough to turn someone I trusted. Which means he knows more about what's happening here than I thought. James had gone very still. He was 8 years old, and he was doing the same arithmetic his father was doing, arriving at the same place by a different road. Cole told him things, James said. About us. Most likely, Ethan said. That's not right, James said, with the fierce, clean moral clarity of a child who has not yet learned that the world frequently does things that aren't right and does them without apology. No, Ethan said. It's not. Then why doesn't somebody stop it? The table was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up sharply in the past hour, the kind of wind that arrived in Wyoming in February and reminded you it had been there long before you and would be there long after. "We stop it," Clara said. James looked at her. "How?" "By not giving up," she said. "By being harder to move than they expect us to be." She looked at Ethan. "What's left one hand?" "Decker. He's solid. Been here 12 years. Good. Then tomorrow we work with what we have and we keep working." She stood and began clearing plates. "Hale wants you to feel outnumbered. Don't give him the satisfaction." Eli had not spoken during any of this, but when Clara passed his chair, he caught the edge of her sleeve briefly, just for a second, the way he had in the window the morning the writer came. She paused. He let go. But his eyes said what his voice didn't, and she understood it clearly. Don't go anywhere. She wasn't going anywhere. The letter from Alderton arrived on the 8th morning, and for a few hours, everything shifted. Alderton was interested. He was prepared to discuss a long-term water rights agreement that would give Ethan enough capital to pay the bank and keep the land. Ethan read the letter twice at the table, and Clara watched something loosen in his face that had been locked tight since before she arrived. "This could work," he said. "I know," Clara said. "I need to ride to Cheyenne, meet with him in person." He looked up. "That's 2 days each way, maybe 3. Then go." "I can't leave the boys." "Ethan." She said his name firmly and waited for him to hear it. "I will be here. The boys will be fine. Decker will be here. Go meet with Alderton and come back with a deal." He looked at her across the table. This woman who had arrived on his porch 11 days ago with a worn suitcase and nowhere to go, who had in 11 days become so woven into the fabric of this house that he could no longer clearly imagine the house without her. "I'll leave tomorrow morning," he said. James celebrated this development by immediately beginning to plan a series of activities he intended to conduct in his father's absence, most of which involved the horses, and at least one that involved the barn roof, which Clara vetoed before he finished describing it. Eli said nothing. But that night when Clara checked on the boys before she went to her own room, she found him sitting up in his bed in the dark. "He'll come back," she said from the doorway. "I know," Eli said. "But he said it the way you say something you need to be true more than you know it to be true." "He's coming back," Clara said again. "Go to sleep." She heard him settle. She stood in the hallway for a moment outside their door and listened to the house breathe around her, the creak of old timber. The wind pushing against the north wall, the horses moving in the barn below, and felt despite everything pressing in from outside, despite the 60-day clock, and Victor Hale, and the thin pantry, and the empty bunk where Cole used to sleep, the solid specific weight of a place that needed her in it. Ethan left before first light. He said goodbye to the boys the night before James, with a long embrace that he cut short because he was 8 and couldn't let himself cling Eli with a longer one, that he allowed in full, his face pressed against his father's shoulder with his eyes closed. To Clara, Ethan said, "I'll be back Thursday at the latest." "Thursday," she said. "We'll be here." He nodded once. Then he was gone. Wednesday night arrived cold and clear, and Clara had just gotten both boys settled. James talking himself to sleep in the middle of a sentence, Eli quiet and still and mercifully resting when Decker knocked at the back door. His face told her before his words did. "Something's wrong in the barn," he said. "One of the horses is worked up bad. Could be a predator got in the fence or—" He stopped. Clara smelled it. They both smelled it at the same second. Smoke. She moved past him before he finished speaking. The barn was already burning on the east side, not roaring yet, not fully caught, but moving with the speed and purpose of a fire that had been set with intention. Decker was shouting. The horses were in absolute panic, that specific terrible sound that horses make when they are trapped and terrified, a sound that got inside you and didn't leave. "Get the horses out," Clara said. "All of them." "Miss Clara, I can't do it alone." "I'll help you," she said. She was already moving toward the barn door. "You can't go in there." "Decker." She turned and looked at him. "Get the horses out." She went in. The smoke was thick and low, and she pulled her coat up over her face and moved fast, hand over hand along the wall, following the sound of the animals. The fire was on the east wall, not yet at the center. She had minutes maybe before the whole structure caught. She found the first stall by touch. More than sight got the latch open, and the horse Buck James's favorite bolted past her and toward the door where Decker was calling to it. Two more. She found them, got them out. The smoke was getting heavier and her eyes were streaming, and somewhere outside she could hear voices, Decker shouting, and underneath it, smaller higher, a voice she recognized. James. Both boys were on the porch. She could see them in the orange light. James frozen with his hands at his sides. Eli with both hands pressed over his mouth. And then she saw Decker at the barn door shouting something she couldn't hear over the roar of the fire catching the hay in the loft, pointing inside. The last horse hadn't come out. She turned back. "Miss Clara." Decker's voice was hoarse. The left beam is going." She was already inside. She found Governor, the old one, the one who trusted nothing in the back corner, legs locked with fear, refusing to move. She got her hands on his halter and pulled with everything she had, talking low and constant into his ear, the way she had seen Ethan do, and the horse resisted, and then suddenly moved, and she was pulling him toward the door, and the smoke was so thick she'd lost all sense of direction. Except forward. Always forward. And then cold air hit her face, and she was outside, and Decker was pulling Governor's lead from her hands, and she was on her knees in the snow, and the barn was burning fully now, the roof catching, throwing sparks up against the black Wyoming sky. She heard him before she understood what she was hearing. Eli was screaming. Not crying, screaming the specific sound of a child whose fear has broken past every wall he ever built and is coming out of him without his permission. He had come off the porch. He was running toward her through the snow, and when he reached her, he dropped to his knees in front of her and grabbed her face in both his small hands, and he was looking at her, checking her, his fingers shaking against her cheeks, and he was saying something over and over. It took her a moment to understand what he was saying. "Mama, Mama, Mama, please don't leave. Mama, please don't leave us." Not Miss Clara, not the careful, measured silence, not the guarded quiet of a boy who had locked his grief so deep inside himself that it had stopped making sound. Mama. Clara wrapped both arms around Eli Calloway and pulled him against her in the snow, and he grabbed hold of her coat with both fists and held on with the full, desperate strength of a child who has already lost one person he loved and is not ever going to survive losing another. James reached them a second later and collided with her from the other side, without a word, burrowing his face into her shoulder, and the three of them knelt together in the snow while the barn burned, and Decker moved the horses to the far pasture, and the Wyoming sky turned orange above them. Clara held both boys. She did not tell them everything was all right. She held them, and she breathed, and she stayed solid and present and real, which was the only thing she had ever had to offer anyone, her actual physical undeniable presence, and which was, it turned out, precisely enough. When Decker got the horses clear and the fire began to pull back to its own center for lack of new fuel, he came to find them. He stood a few feet away, hat in hand, looking at the three of them in the snow, and his face did something complicated. "Someone said it," he said quietly so the boys wouldn't hear. "I found the place on the east wall. Deliberate." Clara looked up at him over Eli's head. Her voice when she spoke was very calm and very clear. "Send a rider to Cheyenne tonight," she said. "Ethan needs to come home." Ethan Calloway rode through the night. Decker's rider had found him before he reached Cheyenne on the road, just past the Miller Creek crossing, and Ethan had turned his horse without a word, and pushed the animal as hard as he dared in the dark. He arrived at the ranch before dawn, still in his trail coat, his face tight with something that had ridden the whole way with him and hadn't gotten any smaller. Clara was in the kitchen. She had burns on her left forearm that Decker had wrapped in clean cloth, and her voice was rough from the smoke, and she was making coffee because it was 4 a.m, and she could not sleep, and there was nothing else useful she could do with her hands at that hour. She heard him come in. She did not turn from the stove. "The boys," he said from the door. "Asleep. Both of them. They're fine, Ethan." He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took her by the shoulders and turned her to face him, and she let him, because he needed to see her with his own eyes, more than she needed the dignity of facing away. He looked at her, all of her smoke-reddened eyes, the wrapped arm, the soot that Decker had helped her wash off her face, but hadn't entirely gotten, and something moved through his expression that was too large and too raw to have a clean name. "You went in," he said. The horses were inside. Clara. Her name in his mouth like that. Not flat, not careful, but rough, with something he hadn't yet given himself permission to say. "You could have—" "But I didn't," she said. "I'm standing here. The horses are in the north pasture. The boys are in their beds." She held his gaze. "I'm fine." He released her shoulders, stepped back, pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table, and stood there for a moment, with his head down, breathing through something she understood was not anger at her, but the specific terror of a man who had arrived home to a disaster that had already happened and could not go back and stop it. "Decker says it was set deliberate," he said. "Yes." "Hale." "Most likely." She poured coffee and set it in front of him. "Sit down." He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the table. "I should have been here." "You were doing what you needed to do," Clara said. "You can't be everywhere, Ethan." "I'm supposed to be here." He said it quietly, without drama, with the absolute weight of a man speaking a thing he had carried for a long time. "When Rachel got sick, I was out in the south field. 3 hours, that's all. And when I came back—" He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. "That wasn't your fault," Clara said. "I know." He lifted the cup. "Doesn't change how it sits." She understood then the full shape of it. The reason he worked without stopping, rode out at first light, came back after dark, pushed himself past every reasonable limit. Not because the ranch required it, because standing still meant being in the place where things happened to people he loved, and he couldn't prevent it. "Ethan?" She waited until he looked up. "You can't protect everyone from everything. What you can do is be present for what comes after." He looked at her for a long moment. "Like you were tonight." "Yes," she said simply. "Like I was tonight." He drank his coffee. Outside, the sky was beginning to separate itself from the dark, the first gray light finding the edges of things. In the silence between them, something settled, not resolved, not finished, but settled the way things do when 2 people have been through the same fire from different directions and arrived at the same place. "Eli called me Mama," Clara said. She said it quietly without preamble because she had been carrying it since the moment it happened, and she needed to set it down somewhere. Ethan went very still. "He didn't mean—" she started. "He meant it," Ethan said. His voice was low and certain. "Eli doesn't say things he doesn't mean. That's the one thing about that boy that has never changed." He set the cup down. "How did you—" "I held him," Clara said. "Both of them, that's all." He nodded slowly. He was looking at her with something she recognized. Now she had seen it building for days, careful, and contained the thing this man kept folded under all his practicality and work ethic and steady decency. The thing that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way some people look at other people when they have stopped pretending they aren't looking. "Get some sleep," she said, before he could say anything else. "You've been on a horse all night." He almost smiled. "You're very good at redirecting a conversation." "I've had a lot of practice," she said. He went. She sat alone in the kitchen with the coffee and the coming dawn and the wrapped burn on her arm that hurt considerably more than she had let on to anyone, and she breathed through it, the pain and the fear that she had also not let anyone see the specific terror that she had felt inside the barn when the smoke closed in, and for one moment she had genuinely not known which direction was out. She had been terrified. She had gone in anyway. That was the only story worth telling. By the time the boys woke, Ethan was back at the barn assessing the damage, and Clara had breakfast on the table, and the day moving forward with its ordinary requirements, which was, she had come to believe the most powerful thing you could do after a catastrophe: insist on the ordinary, keep your hands busy, show the people around you that life continues. James came to breakfast with red eyes. He had clearly been crying, and was equally clearly determined not to discuss. He ate in silence, which was unusual enough that Eli looked at him with concern twice before eating anything himself. "James," Clara said. He looked up. "You can talk about it if you want to, or you don't have to. Either way is all right." His jaw worked. He was 8 years old, and he had watched the barn burn from the porch in his nightclothes, and he had run through the snow to reach her, and she knew that image was going to live in him for a long time. "I thought you were in there," he said. "When the roof part caught, I thought you were still in there." "I got out," she said. "But what if you hadn't?" The table was very quiet. "James," Eli said. He said his brother's name the way their father said theirs, sometimes not sharp, just present. Steadying. James looked at his twin. Something passed between them, the specific wordless communication of people who have shared everything since before they could speak. Then James looked back at his plate and picked up his fork with deliberate concentration. "Papa's gonna make Hale pay for this, right?" he said. "Your papa is working on it," Clara said. "Good." He ate, then without looking up, "I'm glad you didn't die, Miss Clara." "Me too," she said. "Eat your eggs." The news spread through Millhaven by mid-morning. In a town that size, a barn fire traveled faster than weather. By 10 o'clock, Clara knew from Decker that 3 separate men had ridden out to see the damage, not to help, just to look, which was its own kind of information. By noon, something else was happening. Mrs. Hendricks came first. Not Mrs. Pratt. Clara noted the absence, but Mrs. Hendricks, who ran the dry goods store with her husband and had always, in Clara's limited experience of her, looked at Clara with something more thoughtful than the others. She brought bread, and she brought her 16-year-old daughter, and she stood on the porch and said without any preamble, "I heard what you did, with the horses, and I heard about Eli." Clara waited. "I'd like to help," Mrs. Hendricks said, "if you'll let me." Clara looked at her for a moment, this woman who had never been unkind, but had never been particularly kind either, who was standing on the porch with her daughter and a loaf of bread and what looked like genuine discomfort at her own previous silence. "The east wall of the barn needs rebuilding," Clara said. "If your husband knows anyone who could lend a day's work, that would help considerably." "I'll ask him tonight," Mrs. Hendricks said. 2 more women came that afternoon. One was a widow from the east side of town, a small, sharp-faced woman named Ruth Gantry, who had lost her farm the previous year and was living in a room above the mercantile. She had heard, she said, that Clara was someone who understood being unwanted in a place. Clara looked at Ruth Gantry, the worn coat, the careful hands, the particular brand of pride that comes from surviving something that was supposed to stop you. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make tea." It was Ethan who came in from the barn 2 hours later, to find Clara at the kitchen table, with 2 women he recognized, and one he didn't, all of them talking in the specific, low, serious way of women sharing information that matters. He stopped in the doorway. Clara glanced at him. "You remember Ruth Gantry," she said. "She's a skilled seamstress. I thought she might help with some of the damaged tack from the barn." Ethan looked at Ruth, who looked back at him with clear, level eyes. "Course," he said. "We're glad of any help." He went back outside without another word. Clara heard him pause on the porch, and she knew from the particular quality of the pause that he was doing the same thing. She was adding something up, recognizing the shape of what was beginning to happen. Victor Hale's next move came on Friday. It arrived in the form of a legal document delivered by a man in a town suit who was very clearly not from anywhere near Wyoming and was very clearly trying not to show how uncomfortable he was about it. He handed the document to Ethan at the front gate and was back on his horse before Ethan had finished reading it. Ethan brought it inside. He set it on the table. He looked at Clara. "He's filed a complaint with the county," he said, alleging that the fire was caused by negligent management of the property. His voice was flat and controlled in the way of someone managing something that wants to come out differently. He's requesting a county inspection of the ranch and a review of its operational fitness. Clara looked at the document. That's not about the fire, she said. No, that's about finding grounds to have the property assessed below value so he can push the bank to call the loan early. Yes. When's the inspection? 2 weeks. Clara turned the document over, read the back, set it down. Who does the county inspection? Commissioner by the name of Baines. Ethan looked at her steadily. Baines hunts with Victor Hale every October. She let out a slow breath. Of course he does. She thought for a moment. What about Alderton? Did you reach him before Decker's rider found you? I'd sent the telegram. He wired back this morning. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He's prepared to come to Millhaven. Wants to see the water supply himself before committing. 2 weeks. Clara looked at him. 2 weeks. Same 2 weeks. The collision of timelines sat between them on the table. Hale's inspection and Alderton's visit arriving simultaneously, turning the next 14 days into something that could end everything, or turn everything depending entirely on how those 2 weeks were played. We need the ranch looking its best when Alderton arrives, Clara said. Not just the land, the operation, the people, everything. I know. And we need Baines to find nothing he can use. She looked at him. Which means no shortcuts, no gaps, no excuses for him to write in his report. I can get the barn wall up in 10 days if Hendricks brings men. He's bringing men. His wife told me this morning. She stood. I'll work on the house and the records. If this goes to any kind of formal review, your books need to be clean and clear. Ethan watched her move toward the shelf where the ledger sat. Clara. She turned. Why are you doing this? He said. It was not a challenge. It was not suspicion. It was the genuine, careful question of a man who needed to understand something before he let himself believe it. You came here on a temporary arrangement. You owe me nothing. You could leave on Thursday's train and be back in Chicago before any of this lands on you. Clara held the ledger against her chest and looked at him across the kitchen. This man who had stood on a train platform in the cold and offered her basic human decency when it cost him nothing to look away. This man who said, I'm not that kind of man, and meant it, and kept meaning it every single day since. These boys who had given her the name she had not known she was waiting her whole life to be called. I'm not leaving, she said. Clara. I'm not leaving, Ethan. She set the ledger on the table and opened it. Now, let me look at these numbers. He was quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, his expression had done the thing it sometimes did when he was feeling something too large for his particular brand of silence to contain, shifted, opened, become briefly and completely readable. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he had convinced himself was too far to cross. Then he sat down across from her and said, Tell me what you need. The next 10 days moved like a controlled fire, fast, consuming, purposeful. Hendricks brought 4 men on Saturday. Decker organized the lumber. The east wall went up in stages, while Ethan worked the land, and Clara worked the house and the books, and the 2 women who had become 3 and then 5. Ruth Gantry and Mrs. Hendricks' daughter, and a young widow from south of town named Bess, who had nowhere to be, and strong hands and a willingness to work that Clara recognized as its own kind of desperation, given a productive direction. She had not planned any of it. She had simply left the door open and people had walked through it, because that was what happened when someone made a place feel safe. People found their way to it. James appointed himself foreman of the barn reconstruction, with an enthusiasm that exceeded his authority and was impossible to be genuinely annoyed by. Eli worked beside Clara in the house and yard, quieter than his brother, but steadily, reliably present, and she noticed that he had begun to talk more. Not the torrent of words that James produced naturally, but deliberate, considered conversation, the kind that meant he had decided she was worth the effort of being fully heard by. One evening she found him in the kitchen, attempting with great concentration and moderate success to write something in the back of one of his schoolbooks. "What are you writing?" she asked. He looked up, then back at the page. "A story," he said, "about a place far away." Her heart did something it had no business doing in the middle of an ordinary kitchen on a Wednesday evening. "Can I read it when you're done?" Eli thought about this seriously. "When it's finished," he said. "It's not finished yet." "Take your time," she said. "Good stories don't rush." He nodded and went back to his writing, and Clara went back to the stove, and the kitchen held them both in its warmth, without requiring anything more from either of them. The night before Commissioner Baines was due to arrive, Victor Hale made his final move before the inspection. It came through Mrs. Pratt, who appeared at the ranch gate in the late afternoon, with her particular expression of performed concern, and a piece of information she clearly believed would be devastating. "I thought you should know," Mrs. Pratt said, addressing Ethan, and pointedly not looking at Clara, who was standing 3 feet away. "That Victor has spoken to Commissioner Baines about the situation at the ranch, about having an unmarried woman living here with you." She paused. "He's suggesting it creates an inappropriate environment for the children." The yard was very still. Ethan said nothing. Clara could see his jaw working the thing he did when he was choosing his words with great care, because the words he wanted to use first were not the words he intended to say. "Mrs. Pratt," Clara said before he could speak. Her voice was calm and clear and carried exactly as far as it needed to. "In the last 10 days, this ranch has employed 4 local men, housed 2 women who had no shelter, kept 2 children fed and in their schoolwork, and rebuilt a structure that was deliberately destroyed by a man who is abusing his money and his friendships to steal a family's home." She looked at the woman directly. "If Commissioner Baines would like to inspect the moral character of everyone involved in this situation, I would encourage him to begin with Victor Hale." Mrs. Pratt opened her mouth, closed it. Ethan stepped forward. "Thank you for coming out, ma'am," he said. His tone was the kind of polite that has an edge to it, the kind that means we are done here. "Safe ride back to town." Mrs. Pratt left. Ethan turned to look at Clara. His eyes were bright and steady, and he was not quite smiling, but was something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has watched something extraordinary happen and is not yet sure he has the words. "You," he said, "are the most remarkable woman I have ever encountered in my life." Clara felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the cold wind coming down off the ridge. "Don't make it sentimental," she said. "I'm not," he said. "I'm being completely accurate." She looked away first. "Go check on the fence. Baines comes at 9 o'clock tomorrow, and I need everything right." He went. She stood in the yard for a moment with the last of the daylight in her face and the wind in her hair, and something warm and terrifying and entirely new spreading through her chest like the first real thaw after a winter that has gone on far too long. Inside the house, she could hear James and Eli arguing cheerfully about something trivial, their voices layered and alive and filling the rooms, the way voices do when a house has people in it who belong to each other. She stood outside and listened to it and understood fully and without reservation that she would burn down 100 barns to keep it. She went back inside. She made supper. She called the boys to the table. She kept moving forward because that was what she did, what she had always done, except that for the first time in 32 years forward was not away from something. It was toward. Commissioner Baines arrived at 9 o'clock exactly, which told Clara something about him before he opened his mouth. Men who arrived precisely on time were either genuinely punctual or performing punctuality for an audience. And given who had sent for him, she suspected the latter. He was a compact man in his 50s with a carefully trimmed mustache and the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to keep his actual opinions off his face in professional settings. He had brought a deputy and a ledger of his own. Ethan met him at the gate. Clara stood on the porch with Ruth Gantry beside her and watched. "Mr. Calloway," Baines said, "we'll start with the barn if you don't mind." "Don't mind at all," Ethan said. "Though I'd like to show you the east wall first, since that's where the fire was set." Baines's expression flickered, just slightly. "The complaint filed doesn't allege arson." "No," Ethan said pleasantly. "It alleges negligent management. I thought you might want to see the evidence that distinguishes the two before you write your report." He led Baines toward the barn. Clara watched them go and felt Ruth's hand briefly touch her arm. He's good, Ruth said quietly. He's better than he thinks he is, Clara said. The inspection took 2 hours. Clara stayed in the house with the women Ruth and Bess and Mrs. Hendricks's daughter Lily, who had been coming out 3 days a week since the fire, and had in that time become essential in ways that had surprised even herself. They worked. They kept busy. They did not watch from the window more than was strictly necessary, which was approximately every 4 minutes. James provided ongoing intelligence from his self-appointed post near the barn, appearing at the kitchen door at intervals to report that Papa was showing the commissioner the new east wall, that Papa was showing him the ledgers, that the commissioner's deputy had written a lot of things down, that one of the horses had tried to bite the deputy's hat. Eli sat at the kitchen table and said nothing, and wrote in his storybook with intense concentration, which Clara had learned was how he processed anxiety, by going somewhere internal and constructive rather than external and loud. The opposite of his brother in every possible way and somehow exactly complementary to him. Ethan came back to the house at 11. Baines was behind him and the deputy and the ledger was under the commissioner's arm. "Mr. Calloway," Baines said, stopping in the kitchen doorway. "I'll be straight with you." "I'd appreciate that," Ethan said. Baines looked at the kitchen, at the women working, at the boys at the table, at Clara standing at the stove with her wrapped arm and her clear, steady eyes. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something when it doesn't match what he was told to expect. "The complaint as filed doesn't hold up," he said. "The east wall damage is consistent with deliberate ignition, not negligent management. I'll be noting that in my report." He paused. "I'll also be noting the condition of the operation, which is sound, and the mo." He chose his word carefully, the character of the household, which I find nothing objectionable in. The kitchen was very quiet. "I appreciate your honesty," Ethan said. "Mr. Hale is a man of considerable influence in this county," Baines said. His voice had dropped, become something less official and more human. "He's also a man who has been pushing the boundaries of that influence for some time now. He glanced at his ledger. "This report will be accurate. Whatever anyone does with it is their own business." He left. Clara set her spoon down and breathed out through her nose in one long, controlled exhale. Across the kitchen, Ethan looked at her with the particular expression he used when he was feeling something he hadn't yet decided to say. "That's one," she said. "Alderton arrives tomorrow," he said. "I know." She picked up her spoon again. "Lunch in an hour. Go fix the latch on the north gate. It's been sticking for a week." He almost smiled. Almost. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He went. James threw his arms in the air. "We won." "We passed an inspection," Clara said, "which is not the same as winning. Finish your arithmetic." But she was smiling when she said it, and James saw it and declared it a victory anyway, and even Eli looked up from his storybook with something bright and quiet in his eyes. George Alderton arrived the following afternoon in a hired wagon from Casper. A broad-shouldered man in his 60s with a white beard and the permanent squint of someone who had spent 40 years looking at land and water and learning what each of them was worth. He shook Ethan's hand, nodded to Clara, with the respectful brevity of a man who did not make unnecessary social gestures, and asked to see the water supply before anything else. They rode out to the lower pasture. Clara stayed at the ranch. She had done what she could. The books were clean, the property was sound. The case was as strong as they could make it. The rest was Ethan's to carry. She put bread on to rise. She helped Lily repair a section of damaged fence line along the kitchen garden. She listened to James's extended monologue on the personality differences between Buck and Governor with genuine attention, because James Calloway's observations about horses were actually quite astute beneath all the enthusiasm, and she had learned not to underestimate him. Eli came to find her at 3 o'clock. "Miss Clara," he said, then stopped. She looked at him. He had his storybook in his hands, held against his chest the way he held things that mattered. "Eli," she said. "It's finished," he said. He held the book out. "You can read it now if you want." She took it carefully, opened to the marked page. The handwriting was precise and deliberate. Each letter formed with the concentration of a child who understood that words were tools and wanted to use them correctly. She read it standing in the yard in the afternoon light, and she did not rush. It was a story about two boys who lived in a cold house after their mother went away, and a woman who came in from the snow and learned to speak Horse, and how she made the cold house warm again without once saying that was what she was doing. It was 4 paragraphs. It was the truest thing she had read in years. She closed the book. She looked at Eli, who was watching her with that careful, measuring gaze, looking for her real reaction beneath whatever her face was doing on the surface. "This is wonderful," she said. He let out a breath. "You really think so?" "I think you should keep writing for the rest of your life," she said. "I mean that." He took the book back. He held it against his chest again. Then he said quietly, and with complete seriousness, "I want you to stay, not temporarily." He met her eyes. "I want you to stay all the way." Clara looked at this boy Eli Calloway, who had said 10 words together in the first 3 days she'd known him, and was now writing stories and making declarations, and felt something happen in her chest that was so simple and so enormous, it had no drama in it at all. Just the pure, undeniable weight of being wanted. "I'm working on it," she said. He nodded once satisfied and went back inside. Ethan returned with Alderton at 5 o'clock. She knew from the way Ethan walked, not from his face, which he kept professionally composed in front of his guest, but from the quality of his stride, the slight looseness in his shoulders, that it had gone well. Alderton stayed for supper. He ate without excessive conversation, which Clara respected, and observed the table with the same evaluating attention he'd applied to the water supply. James talked. Eli listened. Ethan was steady. Clara kept the meal moving with the efficiency of long practice. After supper, Alderton shook Ethan's hand again in the kitchen doorway. "I'll have my attorney draw up the water rights agreement by end of next week," he said. "You'll have the capital to settle with the bank before Hale's 60 days are done." "I appreciate it," Ethan said. Alderton glanced at Clara, then back at Ethan. "You've got a good operation here," he said. Something in his voice suggested he was not talking exclusively about the water supply. "Worth protecting." He left. The door closed. The kitchen held its breath. "It's done," James said. "It's done," Ethan said. James made the sound of someone who has been holding tension in his entire body for 2 weeks and is finally allowed to release it. He sat down heavily in his chair and exhaled with theatrical relief, and Eli looked at his brother with something that was unmistakably affection, and the kitchen filled with the specific warmth of people who have been in danger together and are now for the first time allowed to feel safe. The twist that none of them expected arrived 3 days later, and it arrived in the form of Cole. Clara answered the door because Ethan was out. Cole stood on the porch with his hat in both hands, and the specific posture of a man who has made a decision that frightened him and is here before he loses his nerve. He was thinner than she remembered. He had not, she suspected, been sleeping particularly well. "Miss Clara," he said. "I need to talk to Mr. Calloway." "He'll be back within the hour," she said. "You can wait, or you can tell me, and I'll tell him." Cole looked at her, made his decision. "Hale's foreman came to me before the fire," he said. "Told me they were going to do something to the barn. Told me to be gone that night." His jaw worked. "I left. I thought I was staying out of it, that it wasn't my business." He stopped. "But a woman almost died." "A woman did almost die," Clara said evenly. "What do you want, Cole?" "I want to tell what I know," he said, "to whoever needs to hear it, formally. If that means testifying to the sheriff or the judge or whoever handles this, I'll do it. The sheriff plays cards with Victor Hale." "I know." Cole looked at her directly. "But the circuit judge doesn't. And Hale's foreman talked too much that night. I got names, dates, specific instructions." He paused. "It's enough." Clara looked at this young man who had made the wrong choice and come back to try to make the right one, which was a harder and braver thing than never making the wrong choice in the first place. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." The circuit judge came through Millhaven 5 weeks later. Cole testified. 2 other men workers from neighboring properties who had their own accounts of Hale's methods testified alongside him. The case against Victor Hale was not a small thing, and it did not resolve itself quickly, but it began there in the county courthouse in Casper, with a young man who had lost one kind of courage and found a better one. Hale's operations in the territory contracted sharply in the months that followed. The legal proceedings were slow, and the outcome was not immediate, but the effect on his ability to move through Millhaven, as he always had, with the casual, untouchable authority of a man who believed consequence was for other people, was immediate and complete. The spring came in with unusual warmth, the kind of Wyoming spring that felt like an apology for February. The ranch had rebuilt. Not just the barn wall, though, that stood solid now, the new lumber bright against the old, but in the less visible ways that matter more. Decker had brought on 2 new hands, both recommended by Hendricks. Ruth Gantry had moved into the small room off the back of the house that had been unused since before Rachel Calloway's death, and she brought with her a steadiness and a practical competence that made the whole operation quieter and stronger. 2 other women from town had begun coming regularly, one to help with the sewing and tack repair, one who had a gift with the animals that even the difficult horses responded to. It was not what Clara had planned. She had planned nothing. She reminded herself. Sometimes she had simply left a door open and kept her hands busy and done the next useful thing, and the rest had built itself around those choices, the way things do when the foundation is sound. The Spring Festival was Millhaven's annual occasion for the entire territory to gather in the town square, and it was the first year in 2 that Ethan Calloway's family came. James wore his good shirt and immediately got hay in his hair within 15 minutes of arriving, which Clara had anticipated, and had a second shirt in her bag. Eli walked beside her with his hands in his pockets and his quiet eyes taking everything in, and he said at one point, "This is better than last year," with such simple certainty that the woman walking past them turned to look. It was better. Everything was better. The Calloways moved through the festival, and people spoke to them genuinely, not with the performance of politeness over private judgment. And several of those people came specifically to speak to Clara, to shake her hand, or press her arm, or say something simple like, "Glad you're still here," in the way people say things when they mean considerably more than the words. Mrs. Pratt came. Clara had not expected that. The woman approached with the specific expression of someone who has had a long conversation with herself and arrived somewhere uncomfortable and necessary. "I wasn't kind to you," Mrs. Pratt said. "No preamble. When you first came, I wasn't kind." "No," Clara said. "You weren't." "I'm sorry for it." Clara looked at her. She thought about what she wanted to say about the station platform in February, about the cold, about 32 years of wearing other people's cruelty, like a coat you couldn't take off. She thought about all of it, and then she said, "Thank you. That means something." It was enough. It was she had learned more than she had ever expected to get from anyone, and she was learning to receive things that were more than she had expected without immediately looking for the catch. She was still learning that when Ethan appeared beside her. He had been in conversation with Alderton's attorney on the far side of the square, finishing something that had been in process for 3 weeks, and from the look on his face as he crossed the grass toward her, it was done. Fully, finally done. "Signed this morning," he said. "The agreement is in effect. The bank note is settled. The north pasture stays." Clara exhaled. "Good." "All of it," he said. "Good." He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she had been seeing more openly in the weeks since the fire, the one he had stopped trying to put away. The festival moved around them. Voices and music and the sound of children, and Ethan Calloway stood in front of her and looked at her with everything in his face. For once, nothing folded down or put carefully aside. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ethan, I've been trying to find the right time for 3 weeks," he said, "and I've decided there isn't a right time, and I'm just going to ask it." He reached into his coat pocket. He brought out a ring. Simple, honest. The kind of ring a practical man chooses because it will last, not because it will impress, and which somehow, for that reason, was the most beautiful thing Clara had seen in years. He held it in his palm between them. "Marry me," he said. Not a performance, not a speech, just the plain, direct, whole-weight request of a man asking for what he actually wants. "I'm not asking because you saved the ranch or because the boys need a mother, though both of those things are true. I'm asking because every morning that I wake up and you're in that house is a better morning than any I've had in longer than I can clearly remember, and I don't want to stop having them." Around them, the festival had gone quiet in that particular way that crowds go quiet when something real is happening, and people recognize it instinctively and stop talking without meaning to. Clara looked at the ring, looked at him, felt the specific terror of someone standing at the edge of something they have wanted for so long they had stopped believing they were allowed to want it. "I'm not easy," she said. Her voice was steady. "I have opinions about everything, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong, and I don't know how to be quiet about things that matter." "I know," he said, "and I'm not going to change how I look." "Clara." He said her name with such complete and utter lack of patience for the direction she was heading that she stopped. "I know exactly what you look like. I have been looking at you since February. That is not the part I'm asking you to change." She breathed. "You're very sure," she said. "I'm the surest I've been about anything since I decided to keep the ranch," he said, which, as you may recall, turned out to be the right call. Someone in the crowd laughed quietly, warmly. James's voice cut through from somewhere to her left. Unmistakable. "Just say yes, Miss Clara. Please, I've been waiting." "James Calloway," Ethan said without looking away from her. "Sorry, Papa." Clara looked at Ethan. She thought about the platform in February, and the suitcase in the snow, and the voice that had said, "My boy needs someone kind, more than someone pretty," and how she had believed him. Then, that first night before she had any reasonable evidence to support it, had simply believed him. Because honesty lives in some people's faces where you can see it, and he was one of those people, and he had not in all the months since given her a single reason to doubt it. She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. His hands were warm and steady and entirely certain, which was exactly what she had expected, because Ethan Calloway, when he had made up his mind about something, was absolutely unmovable. The crowd around them made a sound that was somewhere between applause and the collective exhale of people who have been hoping for something for a long time and are finally blessedly right. Eli reached her first. He found her hand and held it with both of his, looking up at the ring and then at her face with that quiet, thorough attention, measuring, finding what he needed, relaxing into it. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. James threw himself at both of them simultaneously and managed somehow to embrace his father and Clara at once, talking at full volume about how he had known all along, and nobody had believed him, and wasn't he right, and could they have cake now? Clara looked past James's hay-covered head at the Wyoming sky above Millhaven, wide and blue and enormous, in the way that sky is in places where there is enough space for things to breathe, and she thought about 32 years of being too much for rooms that were too small, of standing at train station windows, in borrowed light, of learning to need very little, because asking for more had always cost more than she could afford to pay. She looked at the ring on her hand, at Ethan's face, at Eli's steady eyes, at James, who had already moved on to a detailed plan for the wedding cake and was soliciting Decker's opinion at considerable volume. She had not been too much. She had never been too much. She had simply been in the wrong places, surrounded by people whose capacity for love was smaller than what she required, and she had stayed in those places too long, mistaking their smallness for a flaw in herself. She was done mistaking that. A year later, the Calloway Ranch was the most respected property in the territory, and the woman who had arrived at its door in February, with a worn suitcase and a broken heart, had become the kind of person that people in Millhaven pointed to when they needed to explain what strength actually looked like. Not the loud, visible kind that announces itself, but the kind that stays, that holds, that keeps the fire burning and the door open and the table set day after day without asking to be seen. Eli published his first story in the county newspaper at age 9. James learned to ride governor without falling off, which took longer than anyone had predicted, and which he was very proud of. The ranch took on 4 more women in its first-year widows, abandoned mothers, women the world had decided it was finished with, and found to no one's surprise, except possibly their own, that it was not finished with them at all. And Clara Whitmore, who had once sat in the snow on a train platform and believed she had run out of road. Clara Calloway woke every morning in a house that was warm, because she had made it warm beside a man who had chosen her completely, and on purpose, and understood finally, all the way down to the bone, that she had never been too much for love. She had simply been waiting for people who were enough for her.